We're going to get started in just a second. We just want to make sure everybody's logged in and set up. Okay, before we get started in Thriving Leadership in Times of Uncertainty, this webinar by Vetergy Group, I just want to go over some of the logistics and how it's going to work over the next 45 to 60 minutes. We encourage you to ask us questions throughout. We're actually going to stop if the question it pertains at that moment. We're going to answer it throughout. So please use the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen and ask us anything. And if we don't get to it in the middle of the webinar, we will definitely get to it at the end. We're going to have polls. Like I said, we're going to have a poll after this on PollEv, which I asked you to just now put your location in. We have one more question we want to ask you, so if you can keep that up. At the end of the webinar, there is going to be a survey that pops up in the window. So if you could just help us with our learning process and answer those questions, that would be wonderful. And also, we will be sending you this webinar in an on-demand format within 24 hours. So we just welcome you to share that with your colleagues, watch it again. Again, just want you to have this on hand as a resource. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to David Wilbur.
Great, Jenny. Thanks for getting us started. And Jenny, if you would, just keep chatting out the instructions to get onto Poll Everywhere as we go here, so that anyone that joins as we go or doesn't have the information they need, they can get that for you. Look, I don't need to you don't need to hear from me or anyone else that we are certainly in an unprecedented time right now. 3 simultaneous globally impactful events going on. The pandemic that we're all paying attention to, oil war going on, and a volatile financial market all at the same time, but also under the conditions that we must continue to operate. Many of us are struggling right now with technology and leadership and all those things that we have to do in order to meet this challenge. New paradigms are emerging, and resilience is being tested at a global scale, unlike anything that we've probably ever seen before. Our purpose at Vetergy Group is, in fact, to operationalize resilience in complex organizations. And that is where resilience, if you will, describes how your system responds to situations like this. Look, we all know that equipment and process and software systems and management systems, quite frankly, don't really care about uncertainty, volatility, and change. They continue to operate the way they've always operated. But in the world, or in the conversation and the definition around resilience, we think there's another opportunity. And that's an opportunity for what we call adaptive operational resilience. And human beings are, in fact, the source of that operational resilience. And leadership serves as the framework for operational resilience. And the question really becomes is, how do you measure and improve operational resilience as a component of your operation, particularly during times like this? We have a method for that. It's called our Operational Resilience Index. It's a benchmark survey that we use. And in fact, in this current circumstances, we're offering that to our clients and to you at no cost and no obligation. We'll get back to that as we go here. But the thing that we have to keep in mind during this time is that we're going to get back to a new normal. Leadership, in fact, is going to, in our families, in our industries, and in our nation, is going to lead us back to a new normal. And with adaptive operational resilience as the opportunity, that new normal is perhaps going to be even better than where we were before. We're here to talk about leadership, and particularly leadership in times of uncertainty. Leadership today is not just being tested, leadership is being forged. At Vetergy, oftentimes with the clients that we work with and the leaders that we coach, we have to create almost opportunities or stretching events. This one's a freebie. This one we don't have a choice, but it is an opportunity to grow leadership, and particularly how leadership can not just survive, but thrive in times like this of uncertainty. And I've got a panel for you today that knows a little bit about this exact scenario. We have uncertainty, volatility, rapidly changing environments, and unclear information while being asked to continue to operate. And today we're going to talk about 3 critical or 3 behaviors that we found to be critical out of leadership, not just to survive in this environment, but as I mentioned, to thrive in this environment. And the important thing to remember is that leadership during periods of uncertainty and challenge like we face today is no different than it is during periods when leadership is not being tested. It's the same foundational principles. It's just this is an opportunity to enhance that leadership through the current environment that we're talking about. For those of you who don't know me, I am David Wilbur. I'm the founder and CEO of Vetergy Group, a 20-year career in the United States Marine Corps, serving as an officer and a pilot. I'm joined by an honor to be joined by three distinguished panelists here today, all working with Vetergy. The first one I'd like to introduce is Brian Landry. Brian is joining us from his office in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Brian's also a 25-year military career in the United States Air Force, and Brian has a PhD in leadership studies. Brian's call sign while he was in the Air Force is Coach, and hopefully you're going to find out today why we call him Coach. I'm also joined by David Hitchcock from his home office in Percival, Virginia. David also served as a Marine officer for a 20-year career, as well as an executive in many different institutions in the private sector. David and I have had a lifelong journey with our families and our professions together, and I was very honored a couple of years ago when David joined Vetergy. Finally, Lance is joining us. Lance Muniz is joining us from his home office in Beaufort, South Carolina. Lance also served as a 20-year Marine officer, and he's also what we call the plank holder here at Vetergy, quite frankly, because I can sum it up best by just saying that when Vetergy was formed, Lance was the first phone call I made, and he's been with us ever since. So now hopefully you've seen the change in your Poll Everywhere slide. I'm asking you a new question. During these periods of uncertainty that we're describing in this combination of a pandemic and an oil war, volatile financial market, all while being asked to continue to operate, what are some of the current challenges that you're facing right now that we can talk about? Never-ending changing regulations that we have to follow and react to act at local and state level. Great point. Leaders that can explain tough situations for our organization. We're going to talk much more about that. Stress, clearly, your people, your leaders, your organization, our communities, our families are being stressed right now. Keeping everyone focused in order to work safely. Lack of data. Incredible challenge right now is being able to work in an environment where the information is unclear. It's not that we don't have enough information. We have plenty of information. It's sorting through that information on the pandemic, on the economic environment, and all those things that we have to do. Virtual workforce obviously is the topic of the day. Here we are virtually interacting with each other right now in a virtual environment. And there's new ways of working that are being developed every day by many of our clients. And clearly the one that's highlighted right now, dealing with fluid situations, rapid changes, and new ways to communicate with each other. All very great points. In the interest of time, what I want to do is go ahead and turn us over to our first panelist. That's Brian Landry. And Brian, the questions are coming up here on dealing with stress, working remotely with your people, how to communicate, how to continue to lead in this environment. So Brian, I'd like to turn it over to you. Could you talk to us a bit on how to engage your people during this time?
Yeah, I'd love to, David. Hey, thanks for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Listen, I'm so excited to be here with the opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, that of leadership. And by the way, as I look at, David, if you want to throw the next slide up, on the 141 there, the aircraft I crewed, it was part of Air Mobility's command's shared vision at the time, known as Global Reach, Global Power. Global Reach, Global Power. Because our routine missions span the globe each and every day. Along the same lines, the opening image David showed of the COVID-19 molecular structure in the world reminds me that what we're currently dealing with, and as discussed briefly already, is this is a global issue. But I think it's important to take a step back from this idea of globalism and remember that people experience volatile, uncertain times from a very personal perspective. The global problem is experienced in the individual's microenvironment, in their setting, in their home, so to speak, as we're doing right now. So uncertainty occurs at that individual perspective from their individual lens. So I think it's appropriate as we start discussing these issues today that we look at leadership from a very personal side of things. And I'd like to start by telling a personal story, as a matter of fact. It's somewhat different. It's not a story of my leadership, but actually a story of me receiving great leadership at a time that was uncertain for me. It deals back when I was flying this aircraft, the C-141, back in 1992. We were on a mission from Hickam, Hawaii to Yokota, Japan. And it's a long flight, so several hours. We landed at Yokota and we're taxiing to parking, and we get an unusual radio call from command post. What was unusual about it is that they directed, quote unquote, Lieutenant Landry was to report to command post as soon as possible. Now this set off all kind of internal alarms, and I was worried a little bit, and of course the crew hyped in on that and asked me what I was doing wrong and why I was in trouble, that kind of thing. So you can imagine that the walk to command post that day was a pretty lengthy one for me. But when I arrived, they simply gave me a note and said, hey, you need to call your squadron commander. They gave me a phone number. Now this is before cell phones, so back in the day, I used a phone in the command post there, and they, through a few phone patches at different Air Force bases, was passed to my squadron commander in his hotel room somewhere in Saudi Arabia at the time. Keep in mind, we were all stationed in Tacoma, Washington at McChord Air Force Base. Well, he answers, he greeted me and immediately apologized because he knew that getting a note like that was going to be alarming. So he gave me some words of comfort right away, and then informed me that the reason he was having me contact him is that there was a small accident back home that involved my wife and my 2-month-old son, David. It had occurred a few hours ago while I was in the air, flying from Hawaii to Japan. And it seems the neighbor's dog had clipped Jessica completely from under her feet, causing her to land on the concrete very hard. Complicating the issue was that she was holding David, the 2-month-old. And when she fell, she squashed or landed hard on top of the baby whose head had crashed into the concrete as well. As you can imagine, this is a very alarming situation for her especially. They were brought to the emergency room and were told by the doctors that she was looking pretty good, but that they had concerns for the baby dealing with a concussion and possible swelling on his brain. I tell you this story because it highlights the first critical behavior I think we need to talk about today, which is caring for people. Now, keep in mind, the first thing my commander did was to connect with me. From halfway around the world, he took time and the necessary steps to find me in the system and take the appropriate steps to get a message to me. He knew that being separated from the family was already difficult for us, and he figured if something happened back home while I was away, I'd have some pretty strong emotions about it. He understood that. So he wanted to let me know as soon as possible himself what was going on. But he also took time to ask me one very important question, and that was, hey, how are you feeling about this, coach? Then, more impressively, he listened very hard. He listened to each and everything I said. And I recall how well he listened because after I finished, he went down a list, line by line, addressing each and every one of the things I had spoke about. What I remember feeling from that conversation was that I was not alone. I had someone I could call who was empathetic to what I was dealing with. And I recall the comfort that he instilled in me, knowing that there was a team back home taking care of Jessica and the baby, and that they were being well cared for, and I could press on with my mission. It gave me a sense of security and relieved any of the worries I had. And what that allowed him to do as the next step was to give me a dose of optimism. While dealing with a situation that I couldn't be part of, it was excruciating not being there to be able to help or hold Jessica. He gave me some hope and some optimism that there was a brighter future. Now, this is a little bit different than being positive. When I say optimism, I'm not talking about just being positive. Positivity might be saying things are good even when they're not. And it's not about being naive as well. We're not denying what happened. he actually acknowledged the actual events that took place, and we knew my son could be hurt. What I'm talking about when I say optimism is the belief that there is a positive picture in the future. Sure, you might be in hard times now. We might be in hard times now. It might be a difficult situation. We're having to deal with all kinds of issues. But the message is we will get through this situation. Optimism then, in this sense, becomes a fundamental belief that there is light at the end of that tunnel, that we are heading to that light. We are there. You know, it reminds me, Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher, said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." So a lesson from being optimistic is that if your people know the target they are shooting for, and they have at least a path to get there, they can see that finish line, then bearing the difficult and the current times that we're in, no matter what they are, all of a sudden become more tolerable. In a sense, it brings hope to them. That's what I mean by being optimistic. Now, to be optimistic, of course, you have to be able to communicate with your people. And we're finding all kinds of innovative ways to communicate with our folks. Just like you've heard us at Venergy speak relentlessly about over-communicating a shared vision in the organization, leaders need to communicate, and I'll even say over-communicate during times of uncertainty. I love hearing that some of our clients are holding things like weekly town hall meetings. Be it 400 or 500 strong people, they're having town hall meetings so that they can communicate with their folks. Some of our other clients who are smaller in number, they're using things like Zoom and having meetings every morning. And don't think that because you're the leader, when you have these meetings, you have to have all the answer. You don't. But you do need to communicate what you know. You need to communicate about what you don't know as well. The point is to keep your people as informed as you are. Another idea is not to shy away from the hard stuff. People will find out the reality of what's going on one way or another. You can't hide that pink slip of furlough or laid off people from them. They're going to eventually get it. Why not you, as their leader, be the source of those kind of things that are coming to them? Let them deal with it. Why not do that instead of letting a rumor mill pass inaccurate information and being unable to control what's being told to them? And when you're doing those kind of things, you're practicing being transparent and being authentic. And that brings me to my next point. Leaders need to model what they value. Now, I remember during commander's calls when I was at lieutenant, hearing my commander stand in front of the whole squadron, talk about how much he cared about us. That day when he called me, or when I called him and he explained to me what was going on, it indicated that he was authentic and he was modeling what he was telling us. He truly cared about me and my family that day. Always, actually, but I mean, that day he showed it. Now, I've heard it quite a bit from several organizations. We are family, and I love that statement. But now is the time to act like one. If you truly are a family, then families check in with each other. They offer support when it's needed. They spend time together and so on. Now, here's a big one. I want you to be cautious of this. And we've seen it actually happen, and we've coached against it. Sometimes when organizations react to a crisis, they forget who they are. They start changing everything. Somehow they forget that vision they work so hard to create and build and instill as a culture. Don't lose who you are in response to what is going to be a temporary situation. Your vision was created with the organization's strengths in mind. Tap into that strength and don't forget about it when you need it the most. And speaking of strengths, another thing you've heard us talk about is the idea of teams. We love the idea of working together as teams. Now is the perfect time to allow teamwork to flourish. It does so many things for you. It helps connect people. And people are connected, they don't feel so alone and isolated, especially currently, like when we're hitting times where we're quarantined and working remotely. It helps develop a mindset of we are in this together, which provides support networks to come into existence even when there was something not in place before. Team members begin to feel positive for doing something that's actually helping instead of sitting idle. That builds optimism and is increased, and it also builds momentum. And momentum is your friend. Who knows what teams can produce for you when you allow them to flourish? So when thinking about caring for people, those are just a few of the highlights. Back to my personal perspective, all in all, because of my squadron commander's empathy that day, he garnered my unwavering support. After that call, I would have done anything for him, and I mean anything. He had my support forever. I guess I should tell you that the story that I told, after some tests and some scans and some evaluations, David was just fine. Matter of fact, he and Jessica went home just a few hours later from the emergency room. So everything worked out okay. So David, I'll close with this idea. You know, the great leadership guru known as John Maxwell offers that leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. And if you want to influence your people as a leader, one exceptional method is to care for them. Back to you, David.
Great story, Brian. Thank you. Every time I hear you talk about that story, I always get encouraged by it, just thinking about the impact that it has on us as human beings when we feel valued and engaged by our leaders.
Yeah.
I'd like to give the folks a chance to ask some questions right now. And Brian, we have a first question here from an anonymous attendee, but the question is about what happens when a leader is not the kind of person that typically engages with their people. And now if all of a sudden we start engaging, isn't that going to appear disingenuous or fake?
You know, it's a hard situation to be in, right? If you're one of those leaders, and it's, you know, our minds can sometimes go to the negative right away. Well, why didn't that guy start connecting with his folks personally before all this happened? And of course, we teach that and encourage people to do that, to be connected with your people, right? To reach out to them and get to know them. But sometimes it's just not in the person's personality, right? They're introverted and it's just not their way of being. So yes, I do think, to answer the question directly, if all of a sudden they start doing those kind of things, it's gonna look quote unquote fake or non-authentic. The best answer I have for that is just to throw that situation on the table and discuss it. Tap dancing a little bit here. It might be a conversation where, hey guys, listen, I know I'm not the kind of guy that connects with you regularly, or I know I don't take the personal side of things into to our discussions often, but I'm really concerned about us right now. I'm really concerned about you, and I'm learning as we go through this. And one of the things I've done in my leadership is to build in this idea that I need to connect with you more. So I'm trying. So please help me to do that. And when you're authentic and transparent that way, you start to build some cohesion. People will respond in a positive way if you're authentic with them. So I would say just throw that on the table, get it there, discuss it as a team, and let your folks help you through it.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Brian. And for those of you joining us here remotely, I'd like to just encourage you to submit your questions to the panelists through the, as Jenny mentioned, through the Q&A panel. As we're going we're going to stop at intervals along the way and allow you to ask questions. In the interest of time, I want to go ahead and shift the conversation now towards our next panelist. That's David Hitchcock. And David, as we begin and sort of some of the current challenges that are being faced, were shared, was talking about in a distributed, in a remote or a distributed in a remotely operating fluid dynamic situation with leaders spread out away from contact. One of the challenges is understanding how to empower and how to lead or allow your leaders to provide the leadership that they need to. Can you address that for us, David?
Yeah, thank you very much, Pony. I appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. Really happy to be here with you today. Like Brian, I'd like to start with a story. And, you know, when I was reflecting upon this topic, you know, it reminded me of our combat deployment that came soon after the events of 9/11. My squadron was tasked to deploy to the Middle East in the late winter of 2002 to support Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Southern Watch. And we were based in an air base in Kuwait. And we were flying missions over Afghanistan. And to prepare, you know, you could imagine at the time I was the maintenance officer of the squadron, so I was in charge of about 100 Marines that maintained the aircraft, you know, got them ready to fly, did the repairs and maintenance on the systems and the components of the aircraft. And we had preparing for the deployment had been a very consuming, all-consuming event. You know, a lot of work to groom the aircraft, to get them combat ready and get them deployed. And I at the time was a very hands-on leader. I'd been heavily involved in all the planning and all the how we focused our work streams or focused our teams to get that done. But when we arrived in Kuwait, things changed, mainly due to the fact that now as a pilot, I was expected to fly, to fly my share of the missions. And what that involved to fly from Kuwait to Afghanistan is a 1,500 mile trip one way. So that takes a little over 3 hours. And so you can imagine these missions, 3 hours there, about 3 hours on station, and another 3.5 hours home. You're looking at a 9 or 10 hour evolution. Almost all of our missions were flown at night. And what this meant for me personally was the fact that I was separated from my team for about 2 or 3 days every time I flew one of these missions, because you had a day to prepare. You tried to get get a nap, do your mission planning, get some sleep, fly that night mission, and then you would land around sunrise the next day and go back into crew rest so that you could kind of catch back up. And so it put me very off schedule and away from my team. And what did happen was that my team members, my subordinate leaders stepped up, and they rose to the occasion, took on a lot of the tasks and worries and items that I was handling. They picked up the slack and did it and did it for me, and did it very well. And so my big advice during times like this, when we find ourselves stressed, maybe overwhelmed in some cases, chasing our tail with new requirements and daily meetings, daily changing targets, changing requirements, I would suggest that it is incumbent upon you as a leader is to try to delegate and shed some of those tasks down to your team members and your subordinate leaders, and let them carry some of that water, carry some of that burden for you. One thing you can't do as a leader is just, you're not going to be able to work hard enough or work hard. There's not enough hours in the day, and it's actually going to reduce your own effectiveness if you try to take on more than you can handle and just kind of power through. That'll work for a short period of time, but it's not going to work long term. And of course, we're probably facing months of disruption here with this pandemic. So I would suggest to everyone to pace yourselves and find those members of your team that can help you carry on the burdens of leadership. You go to the next slide, David. This is a great photo. I'm really, this was actually a few years later on my last flight, but that gentleman there, Darren Gallagher, he was Gunnery Sergeant Gallagher with me on that deployment I was telling you about earlier in 2002. This was in 2008. Also, this was in Iraq after my last flight, when Captain Gallagher was there to meet me and congratulate me upon that occasion. But it was leaders like Darren who stepped up and carried some of my helped me weather the storm, helped me through the stresses that I was experiencing as a leader on my first combat deployment, and I greatly appreciated what he did. The secret to that, of course, is, like I said, is empowering your leaders, delegating to them, and giving them the tools they need to succeed. I've got a few thoughts on how you do this and the best ways. And the first one starts with delegating authority. Now, I use the word authority on purpose because you really can't delegate responsibility. As a leader, you're still going to be responsible for what happens and what doesn't happen within your team, or in whatever job you're trying to accomplish, task or mission you're trying to accomplish. But it's fine to delegate authority to subordinate leaders to make decisions and to address issues as they see fit. And I would suggest that you do that as much as possible. The next thing I would suggest is that you make sure that, go ahead, David, if you'll advance the slide for me. Communicate to them what your priorities are. Make sure they understand what the team is trying to accomplish and what you need them to do clearly. This is an important aspect. Make sure that they don't have questions. They understand not only what their goals are going to be, but what the greater goals of the team are, so that they can act with the bigger goals in mind. I'd also make clear to them what information you need from them on their task and how things are going. And one of the things you want is once again, if they're executing and doing things to help the larger organization, they're going to need to keep you informed on how those things are going, where they're experiencing difficulties, and also where they're experiencing successes, so that you can understand what's happening and help them where needed. Next, I would ask you to ask this question when you delegate to your teammates and to your subordinate leaders. Ask them how you can help them. What do they need from you to succeed? This is really important because you want to make sure that you've given them the resources, the time, the material resources, and anything else they need to be successful as you've delegated these tasks to them. And then finally, one thing to remember is you really can't go back once you've gone down this path. It's going to be really hard to pull those tasks back and micromanage or take those over again, but that's a good thing. Hopefully, as they've stepped up and risen to the occasion, that's going to make them a more valuable member of the team. And by them taking some of these burdens off your plate, it's going to allow you to maybe focus on, initially, right now, the crisis at hand, but later it's going to allow you to focus on ways to improve your organization, improve your team, maybe exploit other opportunities in the business or in the or that appear when this pandemic passes. So once again, one of the things that we suggest is a way to help you during this time of uncertainty and crisis is to work to empower your people, empower your subordinate leaders, and have them help you take on some of the burden of leadership of the organization.
Great story, David. Thanks for sharing that. I was there with you on that deployment. And I remember, again, the uncertainty of the environment that we were working in, and we were being asked to do things that really had never been done before in employing that type of aircraft and that type of environment. And it, as you said, it required us to operate in a completely new model of leadership, of operations, and everything that we had to adapt to. And an operation that ended up distributed across the globe, quite frankly. So thanks for sharing that story. I'd like to turn it over to a couple of questions from the group then. The first one, an anonymous attendee here: what do I do if my subordinate leaders fail to step up or handle the increased responsibility that we need from them?
Well, that's a great question, and I would tell you that that's something you're going to have to be prepared for as you do delegate tasks and authorities to your team. You need to realize that they're not always going to do it exactly the way you would do it, and they're not always going to be successful. So we need to be tolerant of error and mistakes, and use those not as use those as a resource, frankly, to grow and develop your people. I think this is a great opportunity, and Lance will talk about this more, but this is a great opportunity to learn and grow and develop as an organization. And you should see these are more as training opportunities or development opportunities than errors or problems.
David, any advice on how to know what to delegate, what can be delegated to subordinate leaders? Yeah,
that's another good question. One of the things I would do, there's two things I would do, to facilitate this, this exercise. The first is, of course, sit down and maybe prioritize things yourself in your own mind of what are the most important things that you're doing to the least important. I would suggest that maybe some of the very critical tasks you may want to stay involved in. But then the best way to figure out what to delegate or what to pass off is to go and ask your subordinates what they want to do or where they think they could best help. They're gonna in that manner, they're gonna take more ownership of what's passed off to them. It'll also let you know where they see their own strengths and weaknesses and where they think they can be most effective. And so I would encourage you to go and be honest with them. Tell them, hey, I need help. I need to share some of these burdens, some of these tasks with you. What do you guys think? Where do you guys think you can best help me? And I think that's a great conversation to have. And I think that by and large, you're going to find that people are going to jump on the opportunity to assist and to gain new responsibilities and gain new accountabilities.
Great. Thank you, David. Thanks for that very good discussion on how important it is to be able to delegate and empower leaders in order to continue to operate in this environment. I'd like to turn it over now to our third and final panelist, Lance Muniz. And Lance, when we started, we were talking about the ability to adapt our resilience, adapt our organization, and as a result of the current challenges, become new organization, new and better at what we do. I'd like for you to lead us in a discussion on that.
All right, thank you. Like the other panelists, I'm going to use a short story to illustrate some points as well. In 2014, I was working as an environmental health and safety lead in an energy exploration project on the east coast of Africa. At that time, on the other side of the continent, there was an Ebola outbreak near Sierra Leone. I didn't think too much of it at the time, really didn't impact us that much because it was some 4,000 miles away on the other side of the continent. But as time went by, the Ebola outbreak started to spread a little bit, and it eventually ended up reaching Lagos, Nigeria, which did become an event that we needed to pay a little more attention to, because the majority of the folks that were working on the drill ship were traveling through Lagos on the way to the remote area. That was one of the few airports on the continent that had flights that serviced where we were working. So we recognized that, okay, we're going to probably need to put in some safety procedures, some mitigating steps to mitigate the risk of the virus reaching the drill ship. And what we did was, although the risk at the time was actually quite low, we implemented a questionnaire, travel questionnaire for all the folks that were traveling to the drill ship, as well as we took everybody's temperature when they arrived to the ship. Those steps were appropriate for the level of risk that we had at the time, and they were pretty similar to measures that other folks were taking in similar situations in similar locations. As a few weeks went by, some time went by, we noticed that our performance and safety numbers started to, metrics, they started to slip a little bit. And we realized that, at least to some degree, part of what was driving the slip in performance was the crew was quite worried about getting Ebola. They felt that the measures that we had put in place were woefully inadequate, shall we say. We really weren't quite sure what to do. We realized that we needed to take some type of action, but we really weren't quite sure what we needed to do at the time. So what we ended up doing was probably, I would argue, well, it was quite simple, and it was probably one of the easier things that we could have done. We simply went back out to the crew and looked for innovative ideas. Asked them, hey, what do you recommend? What do you think we should do? What are some ideas that you have? In other words, what we did was we implemented the critical behavior number 3. We worked or looked to innovate and learn in order to come up with new ideas on what we could do to improve the situation that we were in. We've only got a few minutes to talk about organizational learning, and I would say that probably the majority of the folks that are sitting here watching this or participating in this webinar with us probably have some experience or work for companies or corporations that have programs and policies in place that you've got a process for developing decisions, for capturing lessons learned, and for implementing and tracking those corrective actions that have been put in place. It's usually those methods that companies have or that organizations have are they work pretty well when it's business as normal, but when we're in a period where it's a little more uncertain or it's maybe even somewhat of a crisis, the tendency for leaders is to want to act right away. I would submit that really the process probably shouldn't change all that much. And it's even when it's fluid and it's dynamic, it's probably even more important that you look for ways to innovate and learn from the things that you're doing. What we at Vetergy, we've got a couple of, I'd say maybe 3 tips that we would like to offer here today on ways for organizations or for leaders to innovate and learn during a time of uncertainty or during turbulent times. The first one is to actively seek out innovation and diverse ideas. What we did on that drill ship, we really weren't quite sure what to do, but what we realized in asking the question was we got some pretty good recommendations back right away. From the catering crew, they had probably the best idea. And what was interesting is they've got a really unique perspective of the interactions and the dynamics that are on that drill ship. They get to interact and see everybody, 3 or 4 times a day. And it was pretty evident to them that the majority of the folks on the ship were really worried about contracting or getting sick in one of 2 areas, either the dining facility or in the sleeping quarters. So they had some really simple suggestions and things that could be implemented in a pretty quick fashion. What they did was they put hand sanitizing all throughout the dining facility and really all throughout the drill ship. They implemented a policy where you had to have one empty was sitting at the tables. They went through extra measures to make sure that when people finished their meal, picked up their tray, they had somebody right away wiping down all the surfaces, the tables and the chairs. They increased the frequency with which they were cleaning the sleeping quarters and the bathrooms, and they also made cleaning supplies available to everybody on board in case somebody wanted to take additional cleaning steps into their own hands. Seems like it's a pretty simple idea, but what's interesting is those are things that I probably wouldn't have thought of at the time, certainly didn't think of at the time, but merely by asking the question, they had the answer. They were just waiting for somebody to ask the question and be given the authority to implement those steps. Something that can be done really easy is look for opportunities, actually actively seek out those innovative ideas by asking the questions. Number 2 is start the learning process right away. I saw a few of the statements that popped up at the beginning when David asked, hey, it seems like that we all are faced with some challenges getting information and data back. And the best thing to do is be creative. What we did on the ship was the drill ship had suggestion boxes, and what the leadership realized was that by promoting the idea of, hey, if you have a suggestion, if you have an idea, place it in the suggestion box, and we'll take a look and we'll solicit. And we'll look at all that information. The reason that it was really effective during this particular time was because the leadership was really good about once a week taking all of the inputs that they received, writing them down on a spreadsheet, and then answering every one of the suggestions with either, hey, this is a great idea, this is how we're going to implement it, or, hey, good idea, here's why we cannot implement this right at this time. What was important about that was that everybody on board felt like they had a voice, like their ideas were heard, and even though their idea wasn't implemented, it didn't go away into a black hole. It was heard, it was read, they could see that there was some feedback, and they saw that, hey, ideas that were incorporated went a long way for the morale, but even the ones that weren't incorporated, people understood why. I realized that maybe you can't do that right now with the environment that we're in, but there are certainly virtual means by which you can solicit and open opportunities for feedback. And that's really the important thing, is to collect the data, start learning right away, and be creative about the channels that you make available to everybody to not only give you information, but to provide that information and feedback back to let them know that, hey, you were heard, and here's what we're going to do, and maybe here's why we can't do that. Finally, the third idea is to incorporate micro-learning when you can. Those are short lessons on specific topics. So, especially in turbulent times where the situation is fluid and dynamic, and we're not quite sure if what's coming right around the next corner, the idea of having micro-learning can be an effective way back to your employees. All micro-learning is short lessons, short opportunities to provide lessons learned, or short instructional periods on very, very detailed or very specific topics. You can incorporate those strategically throughout the day, perhaps at the beginning or at the end of the shift, part of a toolbox talk or a pre-job brief. What we did on the drill ship is we incorporated a training period, a short, 60-second video before the folks got on the helicopter to fly out to the drill ship. We gave them a brief on the Ebola virus, how it's contracted, what it is, ways to prevent it, and what we were doing to mitigate the risks. So, look for opportunities to provide feedback through micro learning is an effective way to provide, really communicate with the folks you have working with you. That's all I have to offer here, David. So I'd like to turn it back to you.
Yeah, Lance, thank you. Interesting how parallel that scenario that you're describing is with the current environment that we're facing today. And I think one of the most important aspects of starting the learning, starting it right away, is just that by projecting that future learning focuses our attention on the time after the current period, and gives reassurance to people, gives confidence, and has a calming effect on that. When we first asked for the posts around those challenges that people are facing, clearly this new virtual operating environment is on everyone's mind. I have a question from an anonymous participant here, just asking, do you have a recommendation, and you talked a bit about it, for getting that feedback, getting those innovative ideas, and even perhaps providing feedback in this virtual environment that we're in today?
I would say maybe it probably depends. I think you need to take a look at what tools, what resources. When we're spread out and in the virtual world, it's probably gonna have to be something, some type of channel through IT. But there are a lot of different tools and apps and other sources that are available to us. Technology is pretty incredible. I guess my recommendation would be is to don't stick with just one. Try to make as many channels and as many opportunities for folks to provide feedback. Make them as many available as you possibly can, and then really the important thing is to make sure that you provide that feedback back, so that people know that what they're suggesting isn't going into to a black hole, that people are actually, that you care about it, that you hear them, and that you're providing that feedback back to them.
Yeah, thanks, Lance. I think our Poll Everywhere tool is actually a good example exactly of what you're talking about now. Applications that are available out there that organizations can implement and allow different venues taking advantage of current technology. There are many of them out there, but a good example of one. Listen, I just want to thank our panelists now for a great conversation around these three critical behaviors out of leadership in order to get us through and not just survive, but thrive in the current time. First and foremost is, again, caring for your people. But to say caring for your people is very different often than doing it. It requires deliberate actions, deliberate commitment, deliberate time out of senior leaders in the organization in order to engage and continue to care for your people. And clearly you're going to find out, perhaps through delegation and empowerment of your other leaders, just how good they are, just how capable they are, and just how much perhaps you can give them the space that they need to do the leading that they need to do, and grow them through this whole event. And as Lance led us on, begin the learning process right now, before the information is lost, before the decay of the availability of that data. Start the learning process now in order to keep people focused on that long-term vision for your organization. So thank you very much. I mentioned in the beginning, there's an opportunity for you to take advantage at no cost of our Operational Resilience Index benchmark survey. If you're interested in that, on the information on your screen, you can contact us when that becomes of interest to you. And we will also, as Jenny mentioned, follow up with a link to this webinar on video. With the last few minutes that we have remaining, I'd like to turn it over to the audience's questions now. that we've received through the post on the webinar, as well as on the poll everywhere. And obviously, the virtual environment is got on everyone's mind this day. And I have a question here from an anonymous user, which is asking, how can you build up your team? So grow the team, enhance the team in a virtual environment we're forced to be operating in these days. Do you have some examples of team building types of activities? Brian, would you mind starting us with that one?
Yeah, so obviously, as Lance was talking about, what was hitting me was just the innovation that comes out of teams and empowering your people. All that comes to mind. So yeah, there's all kind of ways, right? And different things are going to work for different people. I've seen around my own neighborhood, people leaving little notes and little gift baskets at their doorsteps, just as a, hey, we're still around, those kind of things. In a virtual world, everything from just a daily check-in, like we're doing with chat rooms and Zoom, and just saying, hey, how's it going over coffee, to more structured things like, perhaps mini webinars where we're actually talking about things that are barriers for us and things that we need to improve on, or adapting to a situation and providing solutions. Engaging those team members, I think you're going to be quite surprised as what comes out. So there's all kind of things. I would just encourage you to get with your team members and let them think about, hey, this is what I would like, and then respond to those. You're showing authentic behavior there, where you're asking them for their inputs and what works for them. So that's how I would approach that.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Time for a couple more questions. David Hitchcock, one of the points that was brought up from the beginning here was this ability to provide effective support and leadership to the front line that is, again, called to continue to operate in this environment when you can't be physically present. As you mentioned, you're in an airplane 1,500 miles away, and yet still you need to support them in virtually. Can you address that concern?
Yeah, David, sorry, just trying to get off mute here. Apologize. That's a great question. I think the way you need to do that as a leader is you need to over communicate. So I would encourage leaders to seek out every opportunity to communicate to their team, seek out every avenue to communicate, and make sure that when you're doing that, you spend time thanking them, acknowledging the stress and challenges you're facing, of course, thanking them for leaning into it and working hard and keeping the faith with everyone. And once again, like I said, I think the key there, and then let them know the expectations you have for the organization, you have for the team, you have for yourself, you have for them. I think these are all great messages, and I think it needs to be a very, you need to, be kind of constant with it. You need to try to over communicate. So use all the avenues, emails, webinars, text messaging, phone calls, take time to call them and talk to them and see how they're doing. I think all of these avenues need to be exploited, and I think that is a great way to try to maintain morale, even when you're not, co-located or not able to see everyone face to face.
Great. Thank you, guys. I appreciate your commitment and your time describing these leadership experiences. The one last question I just want to begin by addressing is this notion of potential for furloughs we heard about in the check-in on protecting FTE health and protecting their paychecks, all while reducing costs. And the thing that I would offer in this environment to all the participants is just remember, being authentic as a leader, recognizing and with empathy their needs, and communicating with them, and at least listening to them and providing them with feedback with authenticity will always serve you well as a leader. Be who you are, be authentic with them, and as human beings, we can handle almost anything. Again, thank you all very much for attending our webinar today. As I see a few folks already starting to sign off, we can stay here for just another few minutes, keep the meeting open. If you have any more questions, please put them into the Q&A box. And other than that, we just wish you all the best. We wish you our prayers and best wishes to your families, to your coworkers, and within your industries as you stay healthy and well during this period. Thank you. You know, guys, one of the things that we routinely hear interacting with our clients is actually people are experiencing an increase in workload. Although we're now at the office less and the plant less, in the field less, we see this natural tendency to sort of add meetings into the day in order to try to replicate or emulate the physical presence that we have and trying to broker that. One of the biggest challenges. Anybody got any ideas on how to avoid adding to your day and adding to their workload, and perhaps even increasing the uncertainty and the chaos?
Hey, David, I would say that's a truism. I see that. You know, my wife works in higher ed, and she's experienced that exact thing, where because of everything that's going on, there's been a real uptick in meetings and conversations, not always productive, even, to be honest. And I think one of the things you need to do is kind of avoid getting too bound up by the meetings, and sit down and think about some meetings maybe that you can get rid of. Maybe some of the routine stuff that you did. I know that's one thing we found when we deployed to combat, is a lot of the routine, a lot of the stuff that was maybe we found out, we didn't know it at the time, but was superfluous, we would shed. And so I do think that if you're going to add a meeting, you ought to think about what meeting you're not going to do anytime you do that. And that might make you think twice about adding the meeting, or it might help you relieve some of the time crunch with the meetings that remain.
All right. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, David. So the thought that came to my mind real fast was along the lines of David, of Sneech's comments, is prioritizing, right? And what I reminded of right away is Lou Holtz in his book called Winning Every Day. And he has an acronym called WIN, what's important now. And I think that's vital, what absolutely has to be done right now, and focus on those priorities, and in structuring the communication processes to hit those win opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I agree with that. I think times like this, particularly when we go into a virtual environment, are going to even perhaps expose some of the leadership traits that we perhaps even or get clouded in the day in, day out routine. And now we go virtually, we see leaders that were otherwise perhaps distracted starting to shift over towards a more micromanagement model, only because it's, again, helping them with uncertainty, not bad people, not bad leaders, just trying to deal with the circumstances. So I'd encourage people to be very open and engage and get feedback continuously from your subordinates on how they're doing and how your leadership is either helping them or hurting them. As David suggested, just continuing to, how can I help you? What's going on? And be open to learning yourself. And also just that longer term vision, making sure that as a leader, you're continuing to, communicate the long term. Let's see, there's a question here on, exactly that, on micromanagement. Perhaps we've answered that one. How do you avoid the perception or reality of micromanagement while you're trying to stay connected? How do you find that right balance? And David, I think you addressed it well by saying, just continue to make yourself available, but maybe perhaps don't get involved in helping them make the decisions or challenging the things that they're doing. Just check in and make yourself available and ask how you can help. What do you guys think about optimism when, in this environment where things are, you know, if someone has you're communicating, you feel like you're communicating the bad news, and you should keep that to yourself in order to project optimism. Are bad news and optimism, do they exist in tension with each other? Brian, what do you think?
No, I can see how human emotions come into play and people can think that. Remember, bad news delivered is not contrary to optimism. Optimism is simply the idea, and Simon Sinek does really well with this. Optimism is knowing that and believing that there's a light at the end of that tunnel, like I talked about earlier. There's a positive outcome to all of this. So even with furloughs coming on, you know, furloughs are better than the company dissolving, right? At least with a furlough, people have something to come back to. So there's a bit of a bigger picture there. And while it's bad news for some individuals, you know, the company surviving is probably a bigger picture. So that's not going to do a whole lot to quench, you know, the individual that's affected in a negative way. But it's still optimistic for the company to believing that, hey, we're going to make it through this. It's hard, but at the end of this day, the innovation that comes from it, the new ways of doing business, and all those things that we're learning during this time will help us to be that much more stronger in the future. So you gotta be authentic and give them the bad news as well as the good.
Yeah, David Sweem's actually given us a good comment here as well, less than a question as it is. There's no, you know, way to look at it is there's just news. It's not necessarily bad news. It's not necessarily good news. But if you deliver those with honesty and as we talked about, transparency, you're going to deliver. That's going to be optimistic in sharing that information. You know, I'll see from Gary Moreau, we've had to deal with the essential versus non-essential when we send people home. And obviously we're all dealing with not only sending them home because of cost control, but also because of just the environment that we're operating in. We had to ensure that had enough work to justify their salary. So another aspect of working remotely, out of sight, out of mind, nobody's sure what the productivity is. It became a concern for the non-essentials wanting to be essential and remain work. It's a tough message to get out. Clearly, again, I think that the importance here again is the truth delivered transparently with authenticity is always going to be the right style of leadership.
Yeah, David, if I may add to that just a little bit, you know, every human, it's ingrained in us. We all want to feel that we're significant. We all want to feel that we're doing something that's making a difference. So it's a hard task, but as leaders, we have to let the entire organization know that everyone is important and significant. And when dealing with the essential versus non-essential, too often we tag the line essential people. And I think if we move towards something along the lines of essential functions or tasks that need to be done, we make it more about what has to happen versus who is doing it. That helps the message a little bit. Mm-hmm. And it lessens the impact of someone internalizing, oh, I don't matter today. And that's not the message at all. It's just if we go to, hey, this has to be done, it's critical, and you just happen to have that role that day, then that's an easier message to swallow versus who's actually doing it.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. David, I see you got your hand up. You want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to add to, I totally agree, Brian. That was, you know, I was going to make a similar point, so I won't belabor that, but just to amplify what he said. The other thing I'd say, you know, there's a couple things on the optimism. One is there's every reason to be optimistic. You know, the global health system, the communication systems that we have today, the ability to transport critical supplies and assistance quickly via the air, all that kind of thing. The world has been better prepared than it is today, despite everything you hear in the news. But we've never been better prepared to handle a global pandemic than today. And we will get through this. I think we'll get through it better than predicted. And I think that you know, this will definitely, you know, will absolutely 100% end. So I think there's every reason to be optimistic with our workforce and tell them, listen, we're going to go through a tough few months, but we're going to come through this. We're going to come through this better and stronger, and we will be better and stronger in the sense that we will all have done this once, and we'll all know that if we ever have to face this again in our lifetimes, we're going to come at it with a clear-headedness and the knowledge that we've gained during this time of trial. Obviously, there are going to be individual tragedies and bad news out there that's going to be tragic, and we're going to have to embrace and nurture those folks that have to go through that individually, families and teams that are going to lose people, and we'll have to address that. But there is absolutely all kinds of reason for optimism on that this is going to end. It's going to end in a not nearly as bad as the kind of the doom and gloom stories that we heard over the last few weeks. The other thing I would say is, as a military person, we've all experienced this essential, not essentially essential, non-essential, but I would tell you that each and every one of us has probably sat at home in the U.S. when our brothers and sisters at arms have been in combat or addressing some issue at some far off place. We've all kind of felt that feeling of not contributing enough. But we need to also right now everyone is doing their part. Everyone that's staying home or doing the social distancing or washing their hands or doing the things to protect our society are doing essential functions, as Brian said. They're doing essential tasks. And so I do think that is, that we need to make sure everyone understands that what you're doing by not coming to work is you're actually protecting the organization, protecting the team, and allowing us to survive this, this challenge that we're faced with right now. So I think that, we need to make sure we're communicating that, and once again, over communicating those talking points, so that people really do understand them, and thanking people for staying home. If you watch the daily briefing, out of the White House, I think the Vice President does a great job of this every day, thanking the American people for doing the right thing by staying home, limiting their trips to the store, and working from home like we're doing today. That is really important to protect the vulnerable members of our society, the people that are most vulnerable to this pandemic.
Yeah, great point, David. I think one of the things you said is, I just want to make a comment, which is that what we don't want to necessarily do is reframe the reality of the situation that we're facing right now. You cannot avoid the negative context, or as David said, the bad news, good news equation, but we don't want to try to reframe it necessarily. Optimism doesn't necessarily mean denying or dismissing the reality. David Sweeney asked a good question here on communication with clients that I'd like to address. I'm glad you brought that up. Most of the webinar has been focused on internal communications and making sure that we're engaging our workforce. Equally important, if not more important at times, is that communication with your clients for all the same reasons. And obviously it's important to continue to communicate with them, because in the absence of communication, as we all know, we'll fill in that gap as human beings, no matter where we are on this side of the relationship, either as a customer or as a internal part of our workforce. We're going to fill in that gap with something, and typically speaking, it's not the best news. It's not what we want. So the more we can communicate with our clients and ensure them where you are in your ability to deliver on your commitments, what you're doing in this current environment to adapt yourself is just going to continue to build your credibility and build that customer relationship during that time. So thanks for that question, David. That's very important that you continue to communicate externally as much as you do internally as well. And Gary Moreau asking the question here on measuring productivity in a virtual workforce, back on your last comment about how you engage non-essential versus essential and validate the work that they have. In fact, what we do typically in that environment where you're shifting away from being present is to shift from sort of a time-based measurement of productivity, which is not necessarily, an accurate one, to more of a task-based measure of productivity, so that you assign, you keep track of the tasks, you assign the tasks that are associated with that job role, that responsibility in the organization. And as they fulfill those tasks, you're able to measure performance against tasks, not necessarily time that's committed to it. And certainly when you start doing the comparison between what tasks are required and how efficiently those tasks can be done, it's almost a natural analysis that gets done on where is efficiency to be gained. Where are some of the wasteful times? What are the conversation around what tasks should you be working on? What are you working on? And you end up perhaps with a cleaner picture of what's required out of that position rather than time-based. So hopefully that's a bit helpful. That is how we look at that and how we try to study that with our clients. So, well, looks like the questions are starting to dwindle there. I just want to thank everyone again for this opportunity to join you using the technology that we've just been talking about today. There's going to be future webinars. I hope you will take the time, as Jenny mentioned at the beginning, to complete the survey that will be coming out. Please give us any feedback. We would love to, core to what we do is improving ourselves all the time, and we need your help in doing that. So thank you for submitting the survey back or providing us with any information we can have to improve ourselves. As I mentioned also, I'll just say again, our Resilience Index benchmark survey is available to you at no cost. We'll follow up with you in an email afterwards with a video, and would ask you to respond to that if you have some interest in taking that survey. One last comment from Gary. I can pick up on the conversation here virtually, Gary, with what's going on in your mind. Not a question, but a comment. Great answer and really helped. Was focused on the time-based work, need to set task-based. So discuss that with your team, and I hope it works out well, and I look forward to some feedback from you. So thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your week. I wish you all healthy and blessed Easter coming up this week, and we'll look forward to talking to you the next opportunity. Bye, everyone.